John said, my topic tonight is a work in progress, a book I'm working on called Rainbow Cities, Philadelphia's Three World's Fairs. And yes, there were three World's Fairs, the successful one, the really bad one, and the one that never took off in the first place. And I really wanted to see what was the variance between the vision and the reality. What did people want out of the World's Fair, and what actually happened? Well, I was also fascinated by the architecture, because the architecture for World's Fairs is very heavily symbolic, but is supposed to be very light and ephemeral. From 1851 to 1964 to 1967, it's produced some of our most fascinating architecture. In 1876, Philadelphia played host to the Centennial, America's 100th birthday party. It was supposed to represent America's recovery from the Civil War. It also was a chance for Philadelphia to advertise itself. It was still America's second city. Chicago was still a big cowtown somewhere out west. And despite some initial difficulties, the Centennial was a huge success. It got over 10 million visitors when our population was only 40 million. And these visitors saw things like the telephone, they saw Japanese art and architecture, and they saw this big hand clutching a torch that was going to go on this statue that the French wanted to put in New York Harbor. Well, there were 5 main buildings, and 3 of them, the main building, Machinery Hall, and Agricultural Hall, were demolished after the fair. 2 buildings, Memorial Hall and Horticultural Hall, were supposed to be permanent. Unfortunately, Horticultural Hall was torn down in 1955 after a hurricane. Well, in 1926, we decided to celebrate a sesquicentennial exhibition for the 150th anniversary. This was a chance to show that we had recovered from the trauma of the Great War, but it also gave Philadelphia a chance to boast how it was the workshop of the world, producing radios, cars, you name it, we made it. Originally, it was supposed to take place on the Parkway, but then the political boss, William Vere, who was their answer to Vince Fumo, said, no, we're going to put it way down south below Packer Avenue in the marshlands. And surprisingly enough, he owned a lot of land down there, and he also owned a construction company that was going to handle all the construction for the fair. Well, the fair was named the Rainbow City because the buildings were going to be tinted in color, they were going to be illuminated in color and light, and the showcase was going to be a gigantic replica of the Liberty Bell, 80 feet tall, 42 tons, and its metal skin would be pierced with 26,000 light bulbs. But the Sesqui was cursed from the start. Lack of money and cost overruns meant that most attractions were unfinished when it opened on May 31st, 1926. It rained on 107 out of 184 days. Basically, you had 6 million visitors out of an expected 40 million. That's 4 million less than they got 50 years earlier. And the architecture was nice, but it was sort of very low-key. This was the Court of the Founders. This was the Palace of Agriculture and Food Products. Woohoo! This was the Palace of Fine Arts. This was a model shoe factory. The World's Fairs were still trade fairs. Philadelphia was a big shoe and clothing town. The most popular attraction out of a fair that was supposed to look forward was something that looked back. It was a recreation of High Street from 1776 with all of these 18th century landmarks, the slate roof house, that's the old town hall there. It was put together by the fair's Women's Committee. It was one of the few attractions to make money. The fair ended with a $5 million deficit. Buildings were auctioned for pennies on the thousands of dollars to satisfy creditors. This was the new Civic Auditorium. It was torn down so they could sell the materials. 6 years later, it was a Hooverville for Philadelphians beggared in the Depression. Well, we decided to try again for 1976, the bicentennial. And again, this was a chance to advertise Philadelphia to the world. In the early 60s, Ed Bacon was reinventing the city. We had Penn Center, Old City, Society Hill. We were the poster child for urban redevelopment. But by the time that 1970 rolled around, when President Nixon named us as the official site of the World's Fair, things had changed a lot in America. A group of architects put together a 3-part for the fair. Penn's Landing was going to be the site of the National Bicentennial Celebration. And there were 2 other sites throughout the city. North Philadelphia, where the North Philadelphia station is, was going to become the model new city. This was going to be a laboratory for urban redevelopment, new colleges, new businesses, new retail centers. And 30th Street Station, I'm talking too fast. this, okay, at 30th Street Station was going to be the international exhibition site. And this was going to be, they were going to build over the railroad tracks to the north where the Cira Center is now. They were going to make it a huge transportation hub, a huge office hub, and again, expand University City down this way. So you were going to have this three-part World's Fair that would also rebuild the city. Well, unfortunately, the price tag was $1.2 billion in 1970. The federal government said, no way, we're going to have a lot of little festivals around the country. So we had a very nice, small bicentennial. Gerald Ford spoke at Independence Hall, lots of fireworks, etc., etc. It was pleasant, but very small. And it was basically a big humiliation. One reporter said, well, the big utopia of 1965 has become the big block party of 1975, but it was a block party with a humongous Sara Lee cake. This was in Grand Court, 50 feet tall at Memorial Hall. Everybody got a little cupcake to take home. Well, one of the reasons World's Fairs are not so big nowadays, besides the internet, is that so much of World's Fair architecture and thinking is now folded into civic architecture. South Broad Street, with all the theaters and the restaurants, it's like the old Gladway at the old World's Fairs. And of course, coming full circle, we have Memorial Hall, our one survivor from 1876, now the new home of Please Touch. In the main lobby, you have a new Statue of Liberty, arm and torch, this time made out of recycled materials. So basically, we have come full circle from 1876 to 2009, 3 World's Fairs. Thank you very much.